The park should have been quiet that morning, children laughing near the swings, leaves whispering in a soft breeze, but all of it collapsed under a single shout. "You're arrested now." The officer's voice cracked like thunder across the open lawn. His arm locked tight around the neck of a black man in a gray suit, dragging him hard against the hood of a squad car. Metal groaned beneath the impact. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. A woman in denim clutched her phone, recording. A father froze with his daughter mid-swing, eyes wide, unsure if this was law or assault. The man in the suit, Daniel Carter, didn't resist. His palm pressed flat against the windshield, his jaw clenched, eyes shut against the chokehold. Calm under pressure, but calm like a volcano that chooses when to erupt. The officer behind him snarled, spittle flashing in the sunlight. "You don't belong here. Not in this park. Not in this neighborhood. Not in that suit." Ugh. And just like that, the world tilted. Daniel's silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation. He'd seen this before at 24, when he was mistaken for a trespasser outside a courthouse where he had just passed the bar. At 31, when a bailiff ignored his badge and demanded he wait in the gallery like any other spectator. And now, years later, as a federal judge, the same script was playing out again. Only this time the cameras were already rolling. A young woman in the crowd whispered, "That's not right." Her thumb hovered over the red record button on her screen. Around her, tension thickened. People shuffled closer, torn between fear of authority and outrage at what they were seeing. The officer yanked harder, voice rising for everyone to hear. "Fake ID, fake man, fake authority. I've seen your type." His partner stepped forward, smirking, already reaching for the cuffs. Daniel opened his eyes. They burned steady, unflinching. He spoke just once, voice low enough that only the nearest officer could hear. "Be very certain about what you're doing." But the officer laughed, mistaking restraint for defeat. "Shut up. You're done." The crowd shifted uneasily. Phones lifted higher. A toddler began to cry. The air wasn't just heavy, it was electric, charged, waiting. And here's where we pause. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Judge Carter. Pinned against the car, Daniel inhaled slowly. His suit creased, his tie skewed, but his dignity untouched. The park around him had transformed into a courtroom without walls, the officer playing prosecutor, the crowd, the jury. Only one truth mattered. They had no idea who they were trying to break. Daniel Carter didn't dress like someone expecting attention that morning. No robe, no chambers, no bench with the seal of justice above his head. Just a gray suit, clean but ordinary, and a burgundy tie that had seen more depositions than dinner parties. He carried no entourage, no flashing lights, no badge on display. To everyone in that park, he looked like any other professional cutting through the morning air after a long week at work. And that was the point. He wanted to disappear for a few hours, to walk beneath trees instead of courthouse ceilings, to breathe air that wasn't recycled through oak-paneled rooms where verdicts weigh heavier than the sky itself. He'd come to the park for solitude. Instead, he walked straight into a rehearsal of history, a play he had already lived in different costume. At 24, he stood on courthouse steps, bar admission letter still warm in his pocket, when a guard shoved him back and said, "Lawyers enter through the front, son. Public galleries that way." At 31, a bailiff asked him to sit down until the real attorney arrived. He had smiled then, placed his brief on the table, and proceeded to argue the case that would change employment law in the state. Now, years later, with the title United States District Judge etched beside his name, the same script repeated, suspicion first, proof demanded second, dignity ignored entirely. His silence under the officer's chokehold wasn't fear, it was memory folding into discipline. He knew raising his voice would only tighten the grip. He knew the crowd would read calm as suspicious, anger as dangerous. So he chose the middle ground stillness. Around him, the park kept breathing. Children ran, a dog barked, a jogger slowed to watch. The world hadn't stopped, but for Daniel, time had narrowed into a single corridor, the officer's arm, the squad car's cold metal, and the faces of strangers trying to decide if they were watching justice or its betrayal. He could feel the tie against his throat, not choking, but reminding. A symbol of the system he carried into every room. The suit wasn't armor, but it was declaration. And here, in the open air, stripped of courtroom titles, it made him look suspicious instead of respected. The officer muttered again, "Men like you never walk away clean." His partner chuckled. Already pulling out a notepad like this was paperwork, not prejudice. Daniel inhaled. His mind flicked, not to escape, but to protocol. He had built safeguards for this exact moment, digital alerts, encrypted files, assistants who knew when silence meant signal. But he wasn't ready to call them yet, not until the officers crossed the line completely. The irony gnawed at him. In 24 hours, these same uniforms would stand in his courtroom, not as guardians of order, but as defendants facing misconduct charges. They didn't know it yet. The crowd didn't know it yet. Only he did, and that was the power of this silence. The grip didn't loosen. It tightened. The second officer, broad shoulders, mirrored sunglasses, stepped forward with a swagger that looked more like performance than procedure. He tapped the side of his holster with 2 fingers and said loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "What are you hiding in that suit, huh? Papers? Drugs? Maybe a fake badge?" Daniel didn't answer. His silence was deliberate, but silence in this park had begun to sound like guilt. The taller officer pulled open Daniel's briefcase, yanking out neatly stacked documents, pages scattered like autumn leaves, fluttering across the grass. "These don't look official," he sneered, lifting one sheet. "Contracts? Legal mumbo-jumbo? Doesn't matter. Could have been printed at home." He crumpled it into a fist. Gasps broke from the crowd. A teenager muttered, "He didn't even check the letterhead." A mother shook her head, whispering to her son, "Don't ever forget what you're watching right now." The first officer barked again, shoving Daniel harder into the hood. "Stop resisting!" The irony was sharp. Daniel's arms had never moved. His hands stayed open, flat against the metal, as if nailed there by composure itself. The taller one reached into Daniel's jacket pocket and pulled out his leather wallet. He flipped it open, saw the federal ID, then scoffed. "Fake. Looks official, but it's too clean. Too perfect. Nice try." He tossed it onto the ground, letting it skid to the feet of a woman recording on her phone. She bent to pick it up, her eyes widening as she scanned the card. "That's not fake," she whispered. But the officers didn't hear or chose not to. More phones lifted. The park was no longer passive. It was awake. Every step, every word was being preserved in pixels. The second officer gestured to the squad car. "Cuff him. We'll sort it downtown." His tone wasn't investigative. It was dismissive, final, hungry for submission. Daniel turned his head slightly, just enough for his voice to cut the tension. "You're escalating beyond your authority." The officer slammed a handcuff against the car hood like a gavel. "Authority? Look around. We're the only authority here." The crowd bristled. A jogger shouted from the path, "That's not how you talk to people." Another voice joined. "Check the ID again. That's government issue." But the officers weren't listening. One laughed, shaking his head. "These people always flash something shiny. Doesn't mean anything." Daniel exhaled, steady. Inside, the calculation sharpened. He had waited long enough, tested their restraint, measured their prejudice. Now, with the crowd swelling, with the cuffs dangling inches from his wrist, he knew the line had been crossed. And once crossed, there was no return. The cuffs hovered just inches from his wrist. The crowd murmured louder, a low chorus of unease, but Daniel Carter didn't flinch. He stood pinned against the cold metal of the squad car, breathing evenly, as if this moment were not chaos but calculation. His stillness confused them. The officer holding the cuffs snarled, expecting fear, maybe rage. What he got was silence. Heavy, deliberate silence. Daniel's jaw stayed firm. His gaze shifted, not frantic but steady, watching the reflection of the crowd in the car's polished hood. He saw the girl with the phone recording, the father clutching his daughter's hand, the jogger frozen mid-stride, torn between stepping in or stepping back. Each witness became part of the record. And Daniel knew. Silence was the record too. "Why aren't you saying anything?" the first officer demanded, jabbing his elbow harder into Daniel's back. "You think you're better than us?" Daniel inhaled. Slow, controlled. Then nothing, not a word. Because words, once spoken, could be twisted. But silence forced them to reveal themselves. Every insult, every false accusation, every abuse would land unopposed. And later, it would be undeniable. The second officer grew impatient, muttering loud enough for the crowd. He knows he's guilty. That's why he won't talk. He reached down, snapping one cuff around Daniel's wrist with a metallic click that echoed across the lawn. The sound drew gasps from the onlookers, the sharp finality of justice turned upside down. Daniel's head tilted slightly, eyes closing for a breath. The cuff bit his skin, but he didn't resist. He let them believe they were in control, let them build their own case against themselves. A woman's voice broke from the crowd. He hasn't moved. How can you say he's resisting? Another added, check the ID again. That's a federal seal. The officers ignored them. One smirked. Phones don't scare us. Daniel finally opened his eyes, not to the officers, but to the crowd. Calm, unbroken. His silence carried a message louder than any outburst. I see you. I hear you. And I don't need to shout for the truth to stand. For a moment, even the children nearby went quiet. The park itself seemed to pause, leaves stilling in the breeze, as if waiting for what came next. The second cuff hovered. The officer raised his voice for dominance. You're done here. End of story. But Daniel knew stories better than anyone. He'd written them in rulings, carved them into law, etched them into history. This wasn't the end. This was evidence. And so, pinned and silent, he let the scene burn itself into memory because he understood something the officers did not. Silence was never submission. Silence was strategy. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. It was leaning closer, pulled into the gravity of injustice unfolding in plain daylight. The first clear voice came from a young woman near the fountain. She wore a university hoodie, backpack slung low, phone raised high. This isn't right, she said, words trembling but loud enough to cut through the officer's bark. He showed you ID. I saw it. Her voice caught attention. Heads turned. A jogger stopped mid-stride, earbuds dangling, his chest rising heavy with adrenaline. He pulled out his phone, not to scroll, but to film. A father near the swing set lifted his toddler into his arms, whispering, "Remember this. This is why we speak up." The officer cuffing Daniel sneered, "Put those phones down. You're interfering with police work." But the park was awake now. Cameras blinked like a constellation across the lawn. A teenager shouted, "We're not interfering, we're witnessing." Laughter and applause rippled, quick but sharp, turning tension into defiance. Daniel didn't move. He didn't need to. The crowd was doing what he knew they would, transforming from bystanders into record keepers. Every word, every shove, every insult was no longer between him and two uniforms. It belonged to everyone watching. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably under the digital gaze. He muttered to his partner, "They're recording everything." The senior one waved him off. "Let them. They don't know who this man is. Just another fraud." But one person in the crowd did know, or at least suspected. An older man in a tweed cap stepped forward, voice low but carrying. "I've seen him before, downtown. Isn't he?" He didn't finish. Doubt was enough. The law student in the hoodie raised her voice again. "Check the badge. That was a federal ID." She aimed her phone squarely at the officer holding the crumpled papers. "You tore up legal documents in public view. That's tampering." The crowd stirred, murmurs rising like a tide. Tampering, abuse, overreach. Words that cut deeper than insults, they were charges. Daniel lifted his eyes toward her, a brief glance, calm but commanding. He didn't speak, but the message was clear. "Keep going." The jogger joined in. "You said he was resisting. He hasn't even moved." A woman echoed, "Exactly. He's standing still." Each voice layered over the last, turning isolation into chorus. The officers, once towering, now looked smaller, cornered not by fists but by fact. The senior officer snarled, "Back up! This is official business." But the father with the toddler stepped forward, his voice steady. "So is justice." For the first time, the balance in the park shifted. It wasn't just Daniel against two officers anymore. It was Daniel, silent and unbroken, surrounded by a jury of strangers who refused to stay silent. And that jury was growing louder by the second. The shift in the crowd should have been warning enough, but authority built on arrogance rarely sees warnings. A third officer arrived, heavier set, cap tilted low, gold badge gleaming like borrowed power. He carried himself like rank alone made him untouchable. The moment he stepped into the circle, he barked, "What's going on here?" The younger officer snapped to attention, eager for cover. "Suspect refusing to comply, sir. Possible fraud. Federal ID looks fake." The senior officer didn't check, didn't ask, didn't hesitate. He planted himself inches from Daniel's face and spat the words loud enough for every phone to capture. Men like you always think a suit hides the crime, but it doesn't hide your skin. Gasps tore through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Did you hear that?" Another voice, "He just said it out loud." Daniel's eyes flickered, not with shock he'd heard it before, but with the weight of confirmation. Silence still his shield. He let the words hang heavy in the air, recorded, undeniable. The new officer jabbed a finger into Daniel's chest. "You're a liar, a con. You're done here." His voice grew louder, harsher, like volume could erase the bias dripping from every syllable. "This isn't your park, this isn't your city, and it damn sure isn't your law." The crowd erupted. Phones tilted higher. A teenager yelled, "Check the ID again. It says United States District Court." The law student in the hoodie shook with fury. "That's a federal judge's credential, you just called it fake." But the officer ignored them. He motioned at the cuffs. "Get both wrists. Drag him in." The second officer obeyed, clamping the metal tight with a snap that echoed across the lawn like a verdict already delivered. The sight pulled a collective gasp from the onlookers. A mother muttered, "This is wrong. All of it." The heavy-set officer sneered at the crowd. "Don't like it? File a complaint, won't change a thing." He turned back to Daniel, voice dripping contempt. "You're not special. You're not powerful. You're just another man caught where he doesn't belong." Still, Daniel didn't break. His shoulders squared against the squad car, his gaze level, his breath steady. The only sound he made was the quiet rhythm of control, inhale, exhale, patience like iron. The crowd grew louder, refusing to be silenced. A jogger shouted, "You can't say that to him." A father near the swings raised his voice, trembling with rage. "That's abuse of power." But the officers pressed on, blind to the tide turning against them. And for the first time, the park felt less like open space and more like a courtroom where the officers thought they were the prosecutors, but the jury had already begun to lean the other way. The cuffs clinked into place, cold steel locking both of Daniel's wrists. The taller officer yanked hard, forcing him to bend lower across the squad car hood. The thud reverberated through the park like a gunshot. "Fraud caught red-handed," the heavy-set officer announced, raising his voice so every phone could hear. "We've got ourselves a criminal pretending to be someone important." He reached down, scooped up Daniel's wallet from the grass, and held the ID high in mock display. "See this? Fake seal, fake name, fake life. Nice laminate job, though." Then slow, deliberate, he tore the ID clean in half. The sound of ripping plastic cut sharper than the cuffs. The crowd erupted. A teenager screamed, "That's a federal ID!" The law student's voice cracked with fury. "You just destroyed government property!" But the officer only smirked, tossing the shredded pieces into the dirt at Daniel's feet. "Evidence of fraud," he said, like words alone could rewrite truth. Gasps rolled through the park. A woman near the fountain covered her mouth. A father holding his daughter shouted, "You just committed a crime!" Phones zoomed closer, catching every fragment of the torn credential glinting under the sunday. The younger officer tightened his grip on Daniel's arm. "Let's move. Jail's waiting." He tugged hard, but Daniel's stance didn't budge. Anchored, heavy, as if the earth itself refused to let him be dragged away. The heavy-set officer snarled, "Still playing noble? You're nothing. A thief in a suit." He leaned close, hissed for Daniel's ears alone, but loud enough the nearest cameras caught it. "Men like you never last. We make sure of it." Daniel lifted his head slowly, eyes steady. He didn't speak, but the silence was deafening. The crowd could feel it, the weight of history pressing into the moment, the quiet fury of a man wronged not once, but countless times. Then came the shove. The heavy-set officer pressed down hard, pinning Daniel's cheek against the hood, grinding him into metal already hot from the Sunday. Children cried out. Someone yelled, "That's assault!" Another shouted, "Stop! You can't do that!" The officer laughed. "He belongs on the ground. That's the only bench he'll ever sit on." Those words, mocking the very symbol of Daniel's true authority, ignited the park. Voices rose, overlapping, furious. The jogger stepped closer, recording from inches away. The law student shouted into her phone live stream, "Everyone watching this is abuse of power in real time." And still Daniel stayed calm, because he knew what the officers didn't. The line wasn't just crossed, it was obliterated. Every shove, every insult, every ripped document wasn't just injustice. It was evidence. Evidence that would burn brighter than any badge. The air in the park was boiling now, phones raised, voices shouting, tension splitting open. But at the center of it, Daniel Carter remained still, his wrists cuffed, his cheek pressed to the hot hood of the squad car. And yet, he was the calmest man there. Slowly, with the measured grace of someone who understood exactly where power lived, Daniel turned his head just enough to speak. His voice was steady, low, but it carried like a bell through the chaos. Activate protocol. The words weren't meant for the officers. They weren't even meant for the crowd. They were meant for the tiny microphone clipped inside his jacket collar, discreet, hidden, linked to his chambers downtown. 3 blocks away, in a secure office, his clerk's computer lit up. A pre-recorded system flagged the phrase, pinging his executive assistant, Mariah Lopez. Her headset buzzed, and she answered instantly. "Judge Carter, I'm here." Daniel's lips barely moved. "Log this moment. Upload all feeds. Begin escalation." "Confirmed," Maria replied. Her voice was crisp, professional, but under the surface was urgency. "Park security cams synced. Live streams are being archived. Backup rolling." The officer above him sneered, thinking Daniel was mumbling to himself. "What was that? Got something to say, fraud?" He pushed harder against Daniel's back. But Daniel only exhaled, calm. "You'll hear it soon enough." Around him, the crowd kept roaring. A teenager cried, "He said activate protocol." "Did you hear that?" The law student shouted into her live stream. "This man knows something. They don't realize who he is." The younger officer faltered, glancing at his partner. "Sir, people are filming everywhere. Maybe we should—" The heavyset officer cut him off, barking louder to drown the noise. "No, double down. Fraudsters always bluff. Drag him in." But Daniel had already shifted the ground beneath their feet. In his earpiece, Mariah's voice returned, louder now. "Judge, confirmation pinged. Federal Oversight Channel connected. Do you want me to patch through the chief?" Daniel lifted his eyes to the reflection of the crowd in the squad car's hood. Faces lined with fury, phones glowing like a jury box filled with screens. He spoke softly, but each word landed like iron. "Stand by. The record builds itself." His silence had been the evidence. Now, his words were the trigger. The officers thought they were in control, 2 uniforms, a man in cuffs, a crowd they could intimidate. But the truth was already shifting, invisible currents moving against them. Every insult logged, every shove archived. Every second streamed to eyes beyond this park. And for the first time, Daniel's shoulders squared not as a man under arrest, but as a judge preparing the bench. The bench, it turned out, was everywhere he stood. The park had become a stage. The officers thought they were directing the scene, but every second the cameras rolled, the script was slipping out of their hands. Daniel Carter straightened as much as the cuffs allowed. He turned his head, meeting the eyes of the heavyset officer who had called him a fraud. For the first time, he spoke with volume, not a shout, but a steady resonance that carried to the far edge of the lawn. "My name," he said, "is Judge Daniel Carter." The words cracked through the noise like a gavel. The crowd hushed, as if someone had flipped a switch. Phones zoomed closer. The law student nearly dropped hers, whispering, "Judge?" The jogger blinked in disbelief. A mother clutched her child tighter, her face shifting from outrage to awe. Daniel's voice did not waver. "Tomorrow morning, I preside over the misconduct case against this very precinct. And today, you've written your testimony with your own hands." The younger officer froze. His grip on Daniel's arm slackened, as though the cuff itself had burned him. He stammered, "Sir, Judge, is this—" The heavyset officer cut him off, panicked. "Don't listen to him. He's lying." His words tumbled too fast, brittle and desperate. "Anybody can say they're a judge. He's making it up." But the crowd didn't buy it. Too many witnesses, too much footage. And Daniel's composure was something no imposter could fake. He lifted his chin higher. "Check the federal docket. My name is there. Check tomorrow's calendar, you'll see which case is mine." Murmurs rippled outward, confirmation building like a wave. Someone shouted, "He's telling the truth, I've seen his face in the news." Another added, "That's Judge Carter from the civil rights rulings." The heavyset officer's face flushed red. His authority, once unquestioned, was crumbling in real time. He reached for the radio at his shoulder, fumbling for backup, but his voice cracked as he spoke into it, betraying fear. Daniel didn't need to raise his tone. Every syllable cut clean. You accused me of fraud in front of your city. You tore my identification. You called me a thief in front of children." He paused, letting the weight settle. "And tomorrow, you will answer for all of it. In my courtroom." Gasps turned to applause. The law students' live stream comments exploded hearts, exclamations, disbelief. The jogger whispered into his phone, "We're watching history right now." The younger officer took a step back, hand trembling near his holster, but not from aggression, from fear. "Sir, I didn't know," he muttered. Daniel's eyes locked on him, calm, unshaken. "That's the problem. You never cared to know." The words landed like a verdict. In that instant, the cuffs on Daniel's wrists didn't look like restraints. They looked like evidence. And the officers, not Daniel, looked like men already condemned. The revelation cracked the park wide open. For a moment, silence held a stunned pause where even the wind seemed to stop moving. Then the weight of Judge Carter's words detonated. The younger officer staggered back 2 full steps, his hands trembling near the cuffs he had just locked. His voice dropped to a whisper not meant for anyone but carried on the microphones around them. "We cuffed a federal judge." The heavyset officer snapped his head toward him. "Shut up! He's bluffing!" But his voice cracked, too thin to cover the panic seeping through. Sweat glistened under his cap. The crowd erupted, voices overlapping into a storm. "You arrested a judge," someone shouted. "He told you! You didn't listen!" another cried. "You ripped his ID in half." Oh, phones zoomed closer, capturing every flicker of fear crossing the officers' faces. The law students' live stream flooded with comments, thousands pouring in by the second. "This is real. This is happening. They're finished. Justice on camera." The jogger, once frozen, now took a bold step forward. He pointed directly at the officers. "You tried to humiliate him, and he owns the courtroom you'll stand in tomorrow. You understand what that means?" The younger officer's knees seemed to buckle. He swallowed hard, words spilling out. "Sir, Judge Carter, I didn't—" Daniel turned his eyes on him, calm but cutting. "You didn't stop it." The heavyset officer tried to salvage authority, waving at the crowd. "This is interference. Back away or you'll be charged." But the command no longer carried weight. Even parents with children didn't retreat. Instead, they drew closer, forming a loose semicircle between the judge and his accusers. A mother with a stroller muttered, "Not today. Not this time." Phones rose higher. A teenager yelled, "Say it again! Say his name!" "Judge Carter!" The crowd roared back, voices shaking the air. The heavyset officer's face drained. He glanced at the squad car as if it could swallow him whole. His partner tugged his sleeve, whispering, "We need to let him go. Right now." But it was too late. The moment had crystallized. The jury was no longer 12 in a box, it was hundreds in a park, thousands watching live. Daniel lifted his cuffed wrists, the steel glinting in the sunlight. What once looked like defeat now looked like evidence in chains. The symbolism was unbearable, law shackled by those sworn to uphold it, and every person watching knew exactly who was guilty. The heavyset officer dropped his hand from the radio. His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since stepping into the park, he had no words, because there was no defense left, only judgment. The park was no longer theirs. The officers stood exposed, uniforms that once shielded them now hanging like costumes torn apart on stage. And Daniel Carter, wrists bound in steel, shifted the balance with nothing more than his voice. He lifted his head, speaking not to the officers but to the small microphone hidden in his collar. Calm, certain, final. "Maria, iniciate immediate suspension protocols. Effective now." Across the line, his assistant's voice rang out clear, piped through a speakerphone already broadcasting to secure channels. "Confirmed. Judge Carter, I am patching through the Chief Justice." The heavyset officer blinked, confusion breaking into panic. "What is this? Who's she talking to?" A voice boomed from Daniel's earpiece, firm and unmistakable. "Judge Carter, this is Chief Justice Reynolds. We're watching the live feeds. Do you authorize full removal of these officers from duty?" Daniel's reply was measured, but it carried across the lawn like a verdict. "Yes. Effective immediately. Strip access. Record this incident for legal proceedings." "Processing now," the chief replied. At that exact moment, the radios on the officers' shoulders crackled. Their call signs fizzled out, replaced by a sterile automated tone. "Access denied. Badge deactivated." The younger officer froze, clutching his shoulder mic like it might come back to life. "Dispatch? Do you copy?" Nothing. Dead air. The heavy-set officer's eyes darted wildly. He pressed his badge against the squad car's digital lock red light. Rejected. He tried again. Harder. Frantic red again. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by cheers. The law student shouted into her live stream, "Their access just got revoked in real time." Daniel raised his cuffed hands slightly, steel glinting. His voice cut clean. "Justice doesn't wait for your permission." Phones caught everything. The officers fumbling, their authority dissolving second by second, while the man they tried to humiliate stood taller even in chains. The jogger laughed, incredulous. "He just fired them while in cuffs." The heavy-set officer stumbled backward, muttering, "This can't be happening. This isn't procedure." But Daniel's eyes never left him. Procedure is what you tried to bury under arrogance. Today, the law reminded you it cannot be erased. The crowd erupted into applause, some chanting his name, others simply shouting, "Justice!" And for the first time since the chaos began, Daniel allowed himself the faintest nod, not of triumph, but of inevitability. The suspension was complete. The officers weren't just humiliated, they were finished. The park erupted like a courtroom after a final verdict. Applause, shouts, the hum of live streams climbing into the tens of thousands. But at the center of it all, Daniel Carter didn't smile. He didn't bask in victory. He stood with wrists still cuffed, suit wrinkled, cheek red from the hood of the car, and yet somehow taller than anyone else in the park. The heavy-set officer tried one last defense. "This isn't over," he muttered, voice thin, brittle. Daniel turned his gaze on him, steady as stone. "You're right. It isn't over. Tomorrow morning I'll see you in court, and there the evidence won't be pixels on a phone. It will be the law itself." The crowd cheered. Someone shouted, "Say it louder!" Phones tilted closer, waiting for the final strike. Daniel raised his cuffed hands for everyone to see. "You mistook silence for weakness. That was your last mistake, because silence, in the hands of justice, is never surrender. It's the record." The words landed like a gavel. Even children hushed, sensing something larger than the park, larger than the day. Mariah's voice buzzed faintly in his earpiece. "Judge, the system logged every second. Your orders are secured." Daniel lowered his arms. "Release the cuffs," he said, voice calm but commanding. The younger officer hesitated, then, trembling, pulled the key from his belt. The metal clicked open, first one wrist, then the other. Daniel rubbed the red marks, not with shame but with certainty, as if even the bruises had turned into testimony. He looked out over the crowd, parents, students, joggers, strangers who had become witnesses. "Justice," he said, his voice carrying to the farthest bench, "isn't a performance. It isn't noise. It is dignity, and it will not be erased by arrogance or uniforms." The park roared back, waves of applause and chants. A teenager live streaming shouted into her mic, "He's free! He's the judge! They're done!" Daniel adjusted his tie, straightened his jacket, and stepped away from the squad car as though stepping off a bench after court adjourned. His last words, quiet but captured by every phone, sealed the moment. "I don't need to film my own justice. I am the result of it." Oh. And with that, Judge Carter walked out of the park, not in defeat, not in anger, but in the full gravity of a man who had turned humiliation into history. The officers stood hollow, their radios silent, their badges useless. And the crowd followed Daniel's stride with reverence, knowing they had witnessed not just a confrontation, but a reminder that dignity doesn't shout, it endures. That justice doesn't bend, it arrives.